The scripture this morning comes from Philippians 4, verses 4 to 9. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. Invite John to come forward. God bless you as you share your message this morning.
In the late 1860s, an artist by the name of Jules Cheret returned to his native Paris after spending about 7 years in London as an apprentice. And what he was apprenticing was a new form of printmaking known as lithography. The printing press had been around for a while, but it was relatively limited. Lithography takes advantage of the properties of oil and water to do these really interesting things that normal printing presses can't do. So Cheret got back to Paris and he started churning out lithographs like these, advertisements, in this case for a new type of kerosene. And at the time, people hadn't seen this sort of thing before. They hadn't seen these large-scale, multicolor prints. And at first, these were admired and even celebrated. Some people credit Cheret's work with helping advance the cause of women's liberation because he depicted women as having agency over household affairs. But if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then Cheret had an awful lot of flatterers because people started taking this technology and just cranking it all the way up. This is pretty early in the lifespan of photography, so there aren't a lot of photographs of Paris during this era, but I did manage to find one, which to my mind looks relatively tame to my kind of postmodern eyes, but this was not tame in the 1800s. This was seen as kind of an assault on the senses. There's a historian of the poster named Karen Carter, and she found an author who was contemporary with Cheret who wrote this. He says, "Nowadays, Paris is nothing more than an immense wall of posters, studded from chimney to pavement with squares of paper of all colors and sizes. A gigantic bazaar where advertising lies in wait for you on all the sidewalks, stops beside you, besieges you, hunts you down, snatches you by the eyes and ears, sneaks in your pocket, sits down in your theater box, follows you home, sometimes comes out of the ground like a jack-in-the-box, and doesn't even leave you alone in the water closet." Some of us have had this experience. We're going to use the water closet, and we're like, hey, there's an advertisement there. That doesn't seem great. And this seems sort of like just the normal course of things now. We are accustomed, when we are out in public, to being assaulted by advertising all of the time. But folks in Paris in the mid-1800s were not used to it, and remarkably, to my mind at least, they actually did something about it. They got so frustrated by this assault on their senses, by this attempt to hijack and commandeer their capacity to give their attention to the world, that they did something about it. The journalist Tim Wu describes it this way in his book, The Attention Merchants. He says, the municipal authorities in Paris took aggressive action, restricting the placement of posters, which they came to view as a blight, as a weed in need of containment. And then he editorializes like this. He says, "Those limits still exist in Paris, and perhaps are one reason visitors continue to find the city beautiful." Now, he may be overstating his case just a little bit, but it is true that there are more restrictions on public advertising in a city like Paris than there are in most American cities. And I've been thinking about this because I've been spending time trying to understand what is going on with our capacity to attend, our ability to give our attention to the world around us, to give our attention to the people close to us, to give our attention to God. And it seems like something has gone kind of wrong with our capacity to attend. And as I've looked around trying to understand other folks who are taking these questions on and trying to think seriously about this, what I find is that again and again, I come across French thinkers, French theorists, French philosophers. You can't read more than a paragraph or two in this kind of space before you encounter a religious thinker or a French thinker, which is a little bit frustrating because I don't speak or read French, but thankfully a lot of their work has been translated into English. And I wonder if this experience of experiencing this kind of assault on their attentive capacity 150 years ago, did this kind of linger with them? Did they learn something from it? That when we find our attention is being hijacked and disrupted and commodified, we actually can do something about it. Like, I wonder if that's part of the DNA, why it is that French folks seem to think more carefully about this than people in a lot of other contexts. But there's another hypothesis that I have that has to do with language itself and the way that language shapes our thought. So I want to run through a couple English words and then their French glosses. I'm going to absolutely butcher the French pronunciation. I apologize for this, but I think you'll get the idea. We, of course, have our English word attention, and then we have a French word, very similar, l'attention. But then we have an English word like wait, which most of us don't associate with attention. But in French, we would say attendez. Do you see the similarity? Or an English word like considerate. To say someone is very considerate. In French, we might say they are attentionné. Or we could say that we expect, like I expect that my remote will work when I get up here in the morning. You expect that I will stop talking at some point. Both of these expectations may be disappointed. We say expect in English. In French, we would say s'attendra. Do you see the resonance, this carrying over? Or in English, we could say that someone should be careful. In French, they might ask for your attentif. There are all of these similarities linguistically between concepts that we in English separate out. Concepts like waiting, being considerate, expecting, being careful. In French, these all have this etymological connection to being attentive. And so it allows a French theorist like Bernard Stiegler to say something like this, that to pay attention is essentially to wait. This is not necessarily a sentence that's intuitive in English, but he's writing in French, and this makes an awful lot of sense. It's almost a play on words. To pay attention is essentially to wait. Or a theorist like Yves Citon, who wrote a book called The Ecology of Attention that I drew from heavily last week, he says this. He says, you cannot be truly attentive to the other without being considerate toward them. Again, in English, this is not necessarily intuitive, but in French, there's this etymological connection. We're using these similar words. To be attentive and to be considerate sound an awful lot alike. These are both relatively recent thinkers. I think Stiegler was writing around 2008, Yves Citon published in 2018, but long before them, there was another French thinker, a philosopher, we might even say a theologian by the name of Simone Weil. There is so much that I want to tell you about Simone Weil. You might hear her name mispronounced as Weil or Weil. You might hear people mispronounce that. I mispronounced it the first time I mentioned her name at the beginning of the series. So that happens. Her name is Simone Weil, and I'm not going to take all the time. But there is so much I want to tell you about this fascinating thinker and activist who lived during World War II. Ask me about her plan that she developed to parachute unarmed women behind enemy lines in combat zones. Ask me about it after the service. I want to tell you all about it. I'm not going to take the time now. But Weil thought deeply about attention and our capacity to be attentive and considered it to be a spiritual act. She said this. She says that attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. Attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. And I wonder if this makes more sense in French because she's clustering together all of these concepts that we might separate out. Things like waiting, being expectant, being considerate, giving care toward. All of these, I think, are tied up in, enmeshed in a life of prayer. This passage in Philippians that Audrey read for us, this describes a prayerful life. I wonder if it's Paul fleshing out what he elsewhere describes very simply as just praying without ceasing. He kind of describes it in more detail here. He says, don't be anxious about anything, but bring all of your requests to God in your prayers, your petitions, along with giving thanks. And then if anything is excellent or admirable, focus your thoughts. Paul's not using attentive language, but I think we can see the resonance. Give your attention toward things that are true, that are holy, that are just, that are pure, that are lovely, all that is worthy of praise. Give your attention to that. And this seems to be part and parcel of what Paul is describing as praying, as going before God, as encountering God. Attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. So I want to think about this concept a little bit, what Weil presents for us, that attention and prayer are very closely linked. She says they are equivalent, that giving attention, being fully attentive towards something is the same as praying. And I think in part that's because both prayer and attention have at their heart, their essence, this encounter, this coming together of two different things, primarily the self and the not self. When we are attentive, when we are giving our attention to someone close to us, or to the world around us, we are encountering them. They and we are coming together in a way that is unusual or perhaps even extraordinary. This is what prayer is as well. Prayer is about coming together, an encounter between me as a created being and God as the source of all being. There's this encounter in prayer. So both giving attention and being prayerful are about an encounter, a coming together of the self and the not self. And it's this overlap as forms of encounter that I think allows Wey to make this claim, that attention taken to its highest degree is the same as prayer, this coming together of things that are fundamentally different. They remain distinct, and yet they encounter each other in an unexpected and profound way. So I want to briefly sketch out 3 types of encounter that might exist in both prayer and attention, to think about what these encounters look like. The first is an encounter between me and us, an encounter between me and other people who are not me. Before Paul offers this exhortation to be gentle in our treatment of all people and to not be anxious, but to be before God continually in prayer, before Paul does this, he offers this very practical advice about human relationships. He says, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to come to an agreement in the Lord, or to be of one mind in the Lord. That's all we get. We don't get the backstory. We don't understand all the details of their conflict, but something has gone wrong in the relationship between these two women. And before this exhortation toward a particular type of prayer, Paul says, I hope that these two people can work out their differences, that they can encounter each other in a new way. And it brings to mind what Yves Citon says about attention, that one cannot be attentive to the other without being considerate of them. There's another way that attention works in this kind of dynamic between me and us. We talked very briefly the first week in this series about the way that our attention is kind of communally shaped, that we attend to what we see other people attending to. Right? Attention follows attention. When we see someone looking in a particular direction, we tend to start to look in that direction as well. And Yves Citon writes really thoughtfully about this. He says that my individual attention finds itself constantly and thoroughly overdetermined by the collective structures by which it is channeled. In other words, my ability to be attentive is shaped by everything that is going on around me, by the relationships that I'm in, by the social structures that I'm in, by the media that I'm exposed to. All of this is channeling and shaping my attention. So what we think of as this innermost part of ourselves, my ability to attend to this rather than that, that is always being shaped by the people and the structures around us. But Citon goes on to say, he says, it is nevertheless equally true that we use our attentional capabilities to open up what he calls margins of agency. That even in this sense that our attention is shaped and structured by forces beyond our control, we still, even in those moments, have the capacity to decide, to choose to direct our attention in this way or that way. And as we use that agency, we actually participate in this shared kind of attention shaping. And so it is me and it is us. Our attention is about encountering those around us, but the things we choose to attend to shape the way that all of us together attend. So I wonder if part of what Euodia and Syntyche need is they need to be attentive to one another. And Paul directs his attention towards saying, I hope that they can find a way to do this, to be considerate of one another, to come to the same mind in Jesus. There's another type of encounter between two different things that happens when we are attentive, and I think also happens in a life of prayer, which is the coming together or the encounter between effort and grace. And there's like 500 years of Christian tradition that is very strenuously insistent upon the fact that these are two very different things and we should never try to join them together. Effort is generally viewed as bad and grace is viewed as good. But attention, I think, draws these two together. Wey actually describes this really eloquently. She says this. She says, what could be more stupid than to tighten up our muscles and set our jaws about virtue or poetry or the solution of a problem? Attention, she says, is something quite different. It's not this kind of muscular effort that insists, I am going to attend to this and only this, and I'm going to grit my teeth until I get it right. I think Stiegler is helpful in this too, where he says to pay attention is essentially to wait. To be attentive, to be truly attentive towards someone or something in the world is to wait, to just be present with that person or that object and to allow it to reveal itself to us. It's not a muscular attempt to dominate over it, it's an openness. But Vey recognizes the difficulty of this. She says elsewhere, she says it's not this muscular effort, but then she says attention is an effort, the greatest of all efforts perhaps, but it is a negative effort. When we are attentive, she says, the soul empties itself of all its own contents in order to receive into itself the being it is looking at, just as that being is, in all their truth. And so to be attentive is to allow whatever it is that exists around us to exist in its own way, in its own sense, to not try to impose or force myself on it, to get it to conform to my expectations or my ideals. It is an openness. So it's an effort, but it's an effort that's then met by grace. I cannot, through my own attention, force something to disclose itself to me. But I can channel and direct my own efforts toward this openness, to be receptive. What is it that exists out there? How can I encounter this other person who I don't understand, this text that doesn't make sense to me, this thing that I'm experiencing for the first time? How can I be open to it? Vey says it's by emptying the soul of all its other contents, not trying to insist this is the way this thing must make sense, but to allow it to exist as it is in all of its truth. So there is an intense effort, but it's met with this unachievable grace. There's one final type of encounter I want to sketch out. I think the one that we would most easily or readily recognize as prayer, which is that this is an encounter between God and creation. Right? Two fundamentally different things, yet things that do and are intended to encounter each other. God desires to encounter creation, to be known by creation. There is a distinction. I am not God, you are not God, this creation is not God, yet God desires to encounter creation, to reveal God's self to us, to be known by us. And Vey again writes movingly about this. She says that the love of God has for its substance attention. So when we say that we are invited to love God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength, this is attentional language. It's about directing our attention toward God and knowing that God's attention is directed toward us. What does Jesus say? Jesus says that even the very hairs on your head are numbered by God. Not one sparrow falls to the ground without God's awareness, without God's attention. God is attentive toward creation and attentive toward you and me as part of that creation. So prayer is this space for encounter. We encounter God's attention directed toward us, and we respond by directing our attention toward God. There's something beautiful and profound that happens in this type of encounter. Well, there's an encounter between you and me, between me and someone else close to me, between me and creation. As that encounter is motivated by my own effort, but yet met by this remarkable grace, or if this is the very stuff of prayer itself, an encounter with God. All of these are profound moments of encounter facilitated by attention. But why does it matter, this coming together of this and that? These two things that are distinct, isn't it fine if they just stay distinct and don't ever have these moments of encounter? Isn't it fine if the world just goes on around us and we never really engage it or encounter it in a meaningful way? Isn't it fine if I just live my life and never really have a meaningful encounter with God or even with another human being? What's wrong with things being separate, staying separate? To think about that, I want to turn our attention toward this image that we've been looking at these past few weeks. Do any of you know what this is? It looks like a plant, and it almost is a plant. It's so close to being a plant, but it's actually lichen. Are any of you familiar with lichen? It's kind of like moss, but it's actually distinct from moss. And what's so interesting about it is that this species is itself the result of two species having an encounter and growing together. So part of what this species is it's a fungus. There's a fungus that's in there that's growing, but this fungus has a problem. It can't access its own food, and it also can't generate its own food. And so alongside this fungus, you have cyanobacteria or algae. And these algae also have a problem. They can generate food, they can photosynthesize, but they can't hold a shape or a structure. And so what you have is this fungus providing its structure, its shape, and then these algae providing food. It was actually the discovery of lichen that led to the coining of a word I think all of us know now, symbiosis. It's the joining together of two species that are different, that are distinct, but they encounter each other in mutually beneficial ways. This particular lichen is often called reindeer lichen because it grows in the sorts of climates that caribou like to be in, which are really difficult, tough climates where there's often not a lot of dirt. So even though this grows kind of like a plant, it doesn't have a root system. It's not able to pull nutrients up out of the soil. Each of these species, the fungus and the algae, are entirely dependent on one another to grow and to survive. It is remarkable. Remarkable. It's a really important food source for things like caribou, like reindeer, because there's not a lot of vegetation that tends to grow in these Arctic tundra. And so this coming together, this symbiotic relationship, it creates something new that is just incredible. When you look at them and you study them up close, scientists are now beginning to say there actually might be a third species embedded within them, a certain type of yeast that they find in growing in some of these lichen. But these grow incredibly slowly, somewhere between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch per year. That is really, really slow growth. 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch per year. And they're delicate. If they get stepped on or trampled, it can take a decade or more for it to regrow to its previous size. So a little over a decade ago, Justin Bieber showed up in Iceland, where there's a lot of lichen, and he filmed a music video that included him throwing himself down a hill covered in lichen. He didn't know any better. He's still basically a kid, running all around, and people in Iceland appropriately freaked out. Because it's going to take a decade or more. Like he filmed this, I think, in 2014 or 15. That lichen still probably has not grown back to its previous size because it grows so slowly, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch per year. And that sort of fragility reminds me of our capacity to attend, to give ourselves to the world around us, to receive the world around us and other people into ourselves, to commune with God. All of that is incredibly fragile. And maybe it feels like the big tech companies and social media companies have kind of showed up like Justin Bieber and just hurled themselves down this hill doing damage that feels like it could last decades, if not centuries. Will we ever get back to our capacity to be attentive the way that we used to be? I think it's a fair question to ask. It's a reasonable question to ask. I feel that my own capacity to be attentive has been incredibly damaged by the society, the culture, the technological moment that I'm living through. And I know that I'm not alone in this. But there's something else that's really remarkable about these lichen. They're so delicate, they can be trampled in a way that does damage for decades. And at the very same time, they are crazy resilient. They grow in environments where most things simply cannot grow. In 2005, the European Space Agency took some lichen up into space. This is something humans do sometimes. We take living things up into space to understand how do things function when they're absent gravity and some of the normal life supports. And what we tend to do is we put them inside a closed container that has some supplemental oxygen. We say, how does it grow in this environment? But the European Space Agency didn't do that. They didn't take the lichen up inside a spacecraft. They took the lichen up and put them outside the International Space Station and said, I wonder what's going to happen. I don't know if you know space, but space is not conducive to things living and growing. It's a vacuum. It's sub-zero temperatures all the time, and there is no protection from radiation. Almost any living thing that you expose to space dies instantaneously. But the lichen lived for 16 days until they brought them back down and they studied them. And yeah, they observed some cellular changes. There was some damage that happened, understandably so, but they were still alive. It's basically lichen and tardigrades can live in outer space, and maybe a couple single-cell bacteria, and that seems to be it. Everything else dies immediately. So you have this paradox, this symbiotic organism, this fungus and these algae, they come together in a way that is profoundly delicate and so easily damaged, yet remarkably, remarkably resilient. And if attention is the same thing as prayer, if Vey is right, that when we give our attention to something, when we give our attention to God, something profound is happening, then maybe it is true that yes, that is fragile, and yes, it can feel damaged and distorted by the moment that we are living through, and yes, it is harder to give our attention over a sustained period of time than I think it was a decade ago, but maybe at the very same time, there is resilience there. Maybe this God-given capacity we have to give ourselves to the world around us and to invite that world into our mind and body, maybe that capacity can endure, can live. can even regenerate and grow. Maybe it's really slow, quarter inch, half an inch per year. Maybe that's the way it is. But if there's this moment of encounter, this symbiotic relationship between me and God that happens when I am giving my attention to something, maybe God is doing this remarkable thing. And so maybe there's hope for our capacity to give our attention to the world around us. And throughout this series, we've been looking at ways that the Christian tradition facilitates this type of encounter, this prayerful encounter with God that allows us to focus and sharpen our capacity to attend. We've looked at contemplative ways of reading Scripture. We've looked at methods of singing that have this repetitive nature to them that shape and focus our attention. But I think probably the earliest and longest lasting form of Christian contemplative practice that sharpens our attention is silence. So we're going to spend some time together in silence. We're going to spend 2 minutes, actually, which, depending on your relationship with silence, may feel like an eternity or may feel like not very much time. But what's going to happen is this image on the screen is gradually going to fade out over the course of 2 minutes, and when that's done, Audrey's going to come up and lead us in our congregational prayer. And as we prepare to enter into silence, I invite you to hear again these words that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, and to consider how you might put them into practice over these 2 minutes. From now on, brothers and sisters, if anything is excellent, and if anything is admirable, focus your thoughts on these things. All that is true, all that is holy, all that is just, all that is pure, all that is lovely, and all that is worthy of praise. Let's spend 2 minutes together in silence.